ask the people you know if a poem or a lyric has ever really meant anything important to them. You may be surprised at how many people will give you an example of one that has. It could be a poem that hung in a classroom or on a poster somewhere, or in even a number of places. There are books about poems that have changed people's lives. In my case, I can point to a poem that is the poem that made me an English teacher. And that poem is Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. One of the reasons, I don't want to go into spoilers yet, but one of the reasons that I became an English teacher as a result of this poem was it gave such a wonderful example to me of how the same words on the same page can have multiple meanings. We'll see that in just a minute. First, let's look at the poem briefly. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there's some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. One of the first things that I think you'll notice about this poem is that it has a literal meaning that's not hard to grasp. In fact, I think we would agree that a reasonably intelligent fifth grader would be able to read this poem and make sense of it. One reason that's true is that the vocabulary is extremely simple. Unless you insist on twisting out and torturing the word evening to somehow make it into evening, and please don't do that. The only word in the entire poem that has more than 2 syllables is the word promises. And believe me, there are no 4-year-olds alive who don't know what the word promises means. So there's no vocabulary in this poem that's going to trick anybody up. All 1 and 2 syllable words with that one exception of promises. Also, it tells a little story. If we make one adjustment, which is to turn the first line around, I think I know whose woods these are. That's the only adjustment I think we need to make. Then otherwise we can leave all the words exactly as they are in the places where they are, and it'll make complete sense. Let's just go through it. I think I know who owns these woods. His house is in the village. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. I'm riding a little horse, or with a little horse that thinks it odd that we're stopping where there's no house. We're between the woods and the frozen lake, so we're out alone on the darkest evening of the year, wintertime, time of snow. He gives his harness bells a shake, so there's a little carriage with bells, to ask if there's some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake, so we are very much alone. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep. And then the repetition, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. The repetition serves the function of reinforcement. It tells us that not only is something true, but the speaker, the narrator, wants us to really see just exactly how true it is. And if we zero in on that one word that I've already called attention to, promises, the poem very much can be said to be, in the mind of our imaginary 5th grade reader, to be a poem about promises. We're out on a beautiful snowy evening. It's very quiet. There's nothing going on except the snow. There's a temptation to stop and stay stopped and just watch the snow fall and enjoy the peacefulness and the quiet here during the middle of winter when we're alone. But, and that's the key word, but the speaker must keep promises. And as a consequence of those promises, the speaker has miles to go before I sleep. How many miles? A lot of them. Miles to go before I sleep. That's a way to understand this poem that makes complete sense and is completely supportable by the words in the poem. Let's look at some slightly different words. The darkest evening of the year. Let's think of that as a metaphor. It can mean a particular time of year, but it can also mean a particular time of life. Think about times when your mood has just been down. When you've been more, however, than just a little bit experiencing the blues, but you've been downright depressed. And think of how it just seems to be perpetually dark. I've heard people talk about feeling a moment of depression, and they can be outside on a beautiful springtime sunny day, and they feel as if they have their own personal cloud following them around, and and threatening them and dropping rain and hail and other objects onto them. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think you understand the point. When you are truly depressed, everything is bad. And there is a temptation not to go on. In this case, we could understand that the little horse thinks it's odd that the person has completely stopped and stayed stopped. And we want to make it a little bit darker. We can focus in on the fact that the woods are, as line 13 says, lovely, dark, and deep, that distance away from town, away from other people, off into isolation, has this peculiar attractiveness to a person who is depressed, until combination of the horse ringing his bells, shaking them to ask if there's a mistake, and the recollection of the promises reminds the speaker that, wait a minute, death by suicide is not part of the order of nature. This would be a violation of the promises that the speaker has to keep. And so, without, again, torturing or twisting the words beyond any meaning that is fairly simple for not a fifth grader, but a reasonably intelligent adult to understand, we can see a potentially very depressed narrator contemplating his own demise. And by the way, if you ever heard from someone who has frozen almost to death and been revived, people will tell you that after the initial pain of the cold, a person simply drifts off, goes to sleep, and goes away. And to a very depressed person, how attractive that must seem. So, as you can see, there are two different ways that we can look at the same words on the same page. We can understand them a little bit differently. The first, as I said, as an intelligent fifth grader. The second, as an adult with some difficult lived experiences. And we can compare and we can contrast the two readings in a way that makes a lot of sense. Or let's take a slightly different view and let's zero in on some of those words. I think I know whose woods these are. I'm not sure, but I think so. His house is in the village, though I do know where his home is. He lives in the village. It's very important that I know where his home is. Also, he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Well, why won't he see me? The only real assumption I can come to there, or interpretation, is that the speaker must know where the person who owns the woods is. And I'd venture, there's a decent likelihood, that the person is at home. My little horse, okay, so we have the horse, must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. The little horse is accustomed to stopping only at houses. So there's something really important about houses in stanza 1, and then again something about houses in stanza 2. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. Well, let's talk about darkest evening of the year in meteorological or climatological terms. What would be the darkest evening of the year? One way of looking at that would be the day of the year that has the most dark, the longest period of dark to dark. The term for that is the winter solstice. It's literally the longest night, shortest day of the year. Every year we reach the winter solstice, and then each day after the winter solstice, the day becomes a little longer, the night becomes a little shorter, and that continues until the summer solstice, 6 months later, when the process reverses and goes the other way. When does the winter solstice come? It comes the 20-something of December. Just keep that in mind. Stanza 3. He gives his harness bells a shake. Now, wait a minute. We have a little horse pulling a carriage with bells. A slightly strange phenomenon. Picture that in your head for a moment. To ask if there's some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. There is nobody else around. Everybody else is presumably in the village, probably at home. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. Let's say I made a promise to one person and another person and a person after that. And let's even say, for the sake of argument, this isn't exactly in the poem, but bear with me. Let's say that some of the people to whom we've made promises are people under a certain age. And then I have miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep. you may have begun to think it's at this point, is that man somehow referring to a particular phenomenon that occurs the 20-something of December every year in American culture and has to do with a little horse with bells and a carriage that we might refer to as a sleigh and a jolly elf who makes promises? Well, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I once had a textbook from which I taught this poem, and it said in big bold letters, "This is not a poem about Santa Claus." I'm going to have to quote one of my favorite literary characters from the television show MASH. There was Colonel Sherman T. Potter. And when he would hear something he really didn't agree with, he would say, and I quote, "Horse hockey." If the poem can support an interpretation, then you can say, with a straight face and with good intellectual intent, that it supports that interpretation. So as you now perhaps can see, we can look at this poem literally and see it as a poem about promises. We can look at the poem metaphorically and see it as a poem about a death wish. We can look at the poem whimsically and see it as a poem about that jolly old elf, good old Saint Nick. And I think each of those interpretations holds up. Now, I'm not going to encourage you to start jumbling those interpretations together. I've had a couple of students over the years ask me about whether we might be dealing with a potentially suicidal Santa. I'm not quite ready for that interpretation of this poem yet. But I will defend against the last textbook editor the idea that if you can take the words on the page and plausibly see an interpretation in them and support it with textual evidence from the work itself, and those are all important ifs, which I think apply here, then you can posit a potential interpretation. That's the reason that this poem helped make me an English teacher, and I hope you've enjoyed this little encounter with it.